assuming it's not a taxable estate and so a formal appraisal isn't required,
Hmm.
usually don't spend the money on having a formal appraisal.
Right.
Instead, I will get 2 or 3 brokers' opinion of value
Right.
from brokers that I know well, that I know that product,
Mhm.
that area, that type of real estate, whatever it might be. And usually there's a pretty good triangulation when you
Mhm.
do that. There may be a range, but you're kind of between here and there.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Probate House Guy podcast. I am Brad Woodall, the Probate House Guy. Today I've got a really special guest, Sheri Samotin, and she has a unique role in the probate estate world. So Sheri is not only a licensed fiduciary in California, but you also have a coaching business where you help people all across the country deal with various issues of your estate. So welcome to the show, Sheri.
Thanks so much.
So why don't you tell us kind of a breakdown about kind of what you do in a nutshell, and how did you get there? Like what got you into that?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, what I do as a fiduciary, as a licensed fiduciary, I act as trustee, administrator, or executor of an estate, power of attorney for finance or healthcare. So, in a nutshell, when somebody doesn't have anybody or their estate plan failed and all the people they named have already passed, I step in. And in those cases, we take the estate plan and we do what it tells us to do. So,
Okay, gotcha. So you're
uh,
like an acting administrator essentially.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
How
And
does
then on the coaching side, we work mostly with adult children who have aging parents and
okay.
aging parent issues, often with siblings. And I also do work with solo agers, people who are aging alone for a whole host of reasons.
Okay, gotcha. How did you get into all that? Like, how do you become a
So
fiduciary in California? How's that come about?
that's a story. So
I
I
love
was
stories.
I was living in Naples, Florida at the time,
Okay,
which, if you don't know, is God's waiting room.
you're right.
So, right, and there's lots of people who go there as first as snowbirds from up north, wherever up north is,
Right.
and eventually become year round. As it becomes harder for them to go back and forth, they end up staying in Florida. And so when I moved, my kids were 2 and 6. Our parents and grandparents were far away. And so these older adults who didn't have family nearby, because their kids and grandkids were up north, they kind of adopted us and we adopted them. And that was awesome. And
Hmm.
then 10 or 12 years goes by, and now all of a sudden they're hitting 80. And I kept being asked, Sheri, can you? Sheri, will you? And as that happened, what became clear is there was a business opportunity. I was originally going to name it Rent a Daughter, but I decided not to. But as I was learning about this business opportunity, I found out there was actually a profession.
Okay.
And the profession for me was a very good fit because I have an MBA and I spent the first chunk of my career in healthcare consulting,
Okay.
working mostly in the areas of psychiatry, neurosurgery, and neurology, which, as you know, are all degenerative disorders, often in the elderly,
Yes.
and often lead to issues.
Yep.
And then the second chunk of my career, I was a chief operating officer in a multi-office real estate consulting firm that was nationwide. And so in that role, I was doing a lot of coaching of executives and my team.
Hmm.
And this gave me the opportunity to kind of take everything I had done before and
Hmm.
apply it in a different way. And what I like to say is at the end of meetings as a fiduciary and as a coach, you get hugs, not
Yes.
handshakes.
That's right. We try to do that too when we buy deals, right? Like that's one of our goals. And people are like, well, that's kind of weird. Like you're buying the real estate. It's like, no, I want every seller that we buy their property to be grateful for us helping them. And usually it's a hug at the closing table when we finally get, because obviously these are super complicated deals. Doing these probate deals and stuff are not like any other deal. There's a lot of baggage that comes with them that we have to solve, and they take longer to get to the finish line. And I love that. Like we love the hugs. That's awesome. So
Yeah.
how'd you get to California? That being Florida, like where's California?
Okay. So I grew up in Los Angeles.
Okay.
I went to college and grad school in New England.
Okay.
I landed in New York.
Okay.
I lived in New York for many years.
Uh-huh.
And then we moved to Naples when my then husband finished his medical residency and fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And we moved down there so he could hang out his shingle.
Uh,
So that was a big circle. And then when my kids went to college and they both told me they were never moving back to Florida, as they referred to it, I moved to LA, which is where my aging parents were.
okay.
So that I could be near them, because given what I do for a living, I knew how much not fun that is to do from 3,000 miles away.
Oh yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah, that adds a whole level of complication being that far away from everyone. So, and I think you and I talked offline, but there's kind of a recurring theme in a lot of, especially in your coaching business, that it seems like a lot of people are far away and you're helping them with that, right? Because there's
Absolutely.
either
Yes.
not resources. So you're the resource. So why don't you kind of touch on like what you do there in terms of that? Like what are maybe some of the common themes that you deal with in the coaching business, and
Sure.
helping people?
Sure. I mean, the most often word that I hear when I take a call from a prospective coaching client is overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed.
Hmm.
And this is generally because the adult children in most families don't really get called in or forced in until there's some kind of a crisis.
Right.
And this often will be that one parent has died and nobody realized how bad off the other parent was,
Sure.
because the two of them together could hold it together, but when the glue is gone, they can't. So that may be, or maybe somebody fell and ended up in the hospital and they got their hip fixed, and now the social worker from the hospital is calling long distance to say, your dad can't go home. Where do you want us to send him?
Right.
So there's these kinds of, and there's as many as, examples as there are families, frankly. But
Right.
the idea is there's some kind of thing that happens that forces the adult children to step into a situation, typically with parents from a generation that didn't talk about money and didn't talk about death.
Yes.
And because of that, these adult children have no idea what resources are available. They don't know what their parents have. They don't know what their parents' wishes are necessarily,
Hmm.
because these are just things that weren't talked about, especially in that generation. I think we're doing a little better now.
Hmm. Right.
And that's kind of my soapbox, is to get people to plan,
Hmm.
and to make decisions and to communicate decisions. And I kind of feel like if I could get one more person, one more family to do that,
Sure.
then it was a good day.
Absolutely. I mentioned this on another podcast episode, but my dad and his dad are dealing with this at the moment, and my grandfather doesn't want to talk about this stuff, and it's kind of sensitive to him. And fortunately for him, I this is what I do for a living, right? I deal with this stuff, and of course, the funny part is my dad's coming to me for advice, and then he's relaying that to his dad, and I'm like, look, first of all, this doesn't have to be complicated. Here's my estate attorney locally that I recommend. He's an old friend of mine from college. Call him. His firm will take care of you. We'll get everything straightened out. And my grandfather's like, well, that cost X amount. And I said, well, Granddad, like after you die, it's going to cost us the same amount to probate your estate anyways. So you're
Actually,
paying
it'll
for it now.
probably cost twice as much.
Right. So just let's figure this out now while you're in good health, while you're of sound mind. But we're noticing him starting to decline. He's 87. I lost my other grandfather this year. He was 93. But my one grandfather's 87 and he's starting to decline. We're starting to kind of notice a physical decline. He's always been a spring chicken his whole life, right? And I think taking care of his yard is what keeps him young and alive, gives him something to do. And they're like, oh, well, we need to move him into it. And like, no, that's his like sanctuary. Don't take him out of his yard. That's his like place,
Right.
until he can't take care of it at all. Don't take him away from that. So yeah, I get that 100%. You know what's funny is you mentioned the word overwhelmed here. We got a text earlier from a lady that is overwhelmed. That's the very words she said. Is I'm overwhelmed. Help me, guide me through this. So, now in the fiduciary business or the fiduciary role in California, how do they find out about you? Like, does the court have a list and they call the next person, or how do you get put into that role?
Sure. So California is one of few states that actually license the likes of me.
Okay.
And because fiduciaries are licensed in California, most competent estate planning attorneys are aware of that. And they
Right.
know what a fiduciary is, and they know that people like myself exist. So that's the first barrier is, when I was living in Naples, Florida, it was no such thing. I first had to educate people,
Mm-hmm.
that people like me exist in what I do. And that was a battle.
Sure.
And then they have to remember about you when the time comes. So the first hurdle in LA, it's way easier because they actually know what a fiduciary is and they know
Yeah.
that we are licensed professionals. Um, what typically happens for me is either somebody is doing their estate plan and they are sitting with their estate planning attorney who says, okay, we've made this lovely plan. Who's going to be in charge of it when you can't, either
Mm-hmm.
because you're incapacitated or because you've passed away?
Right.
And sometimes people will look back at them with a blank stare, or they'll suggest, for example, their siblings. So you'll have an 87-year-old guy suggesting his 90-year-old sister.
Sure.
And an attorney will gently say, probably not a good idea.
Right.
Because generally people think of, their siblings, their friends, their lawyer, their accountant, people like that who
Mm-hmm.
are their same generation. And the probability that they will be willing and able to do it when they need to is slim.
Right.
Uh, Now, if they have kids, they often want to put their kids in. And the attorneys, if they're good attorneys, will ask questions about that.
Yeah.
And like they'll say, I want my 3 kids to be co-trustees. And their
No.
attorney will say, are you sure? And explain the complexity of co-anything, but
Yes.
which is, exponentially harder when it's 3 people than when it's 2.
Yeah.
Um, so there's all kinds of reasons. There's also a lot of people who never married, have no kids,
Mm-hmm.
or married and their spouse is gone,
Right.
or divorced, or had kids that either they're estranged from or predeceased them. I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
so many reasons when I think about my clients that, they need somebody in this role.
Right. And
Um,
California probate, from my understanding, is a lot more complicated than a lot of other states. Takes a lot longer to go through that process too. From my talkings with other attorneys and other people and investors and agents throughout the country, it seems to be a little bit more complicated probate process. And the assets and the estates are much larger. You mentioned offline, right? Why don't you kind of touch on that in terms of some of these people?
I mean, in Southern California, where my practice is based, if somebody owns a home, even if they bought it in 1943, that home now is probably, if it's been maintained at all, it's probably worth $1 million at least.
Sure.
If it hasn't been maintained, it's going to be 600,000-700,000 because then it's what we call a tear down,
Yep.
and it's the land underneath it, which is the value. But
Right.
either way, you're talking about a significant asset that typically is paid off.
Right.
And so, these estates are sometimes more complicated than others, but at a minimum, most of these people have a residence.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's usually it's a requirement, and in many states it's this way. There's a requirement for a bond for an administrator to get a bond because they're dealing with money with the estate, right? You need somewhat responsible person to manage this money and distribute these assets and pay the creditors and all these things. And some people can't afford the bond. Like that they just can't, for one reason or another, can't afford that. And especially with given the size of the assets in California compared to other states, just because the real estate values are so high, that makes the bond price higher.
Correct. And even if they could afford it, or if the estate could pay for it, they are not bondable.
Right.
So meaning they don't meet the qualifications of the bonding agency to receive that bond.
Yeah, for bad credit or,
prior bankruptcies or prior incarceration or whatever it's been.
Yeah.
There's again many reasons why somebody may not be bondable, but
Yeah.
if they're not, then at least in Southern California, the court will not allow them to serve.
Right. Now, if you let's say the court appoints you as fiduciary of an estate, do you get a lot of pushback from the family that maybe someone was supposed to be the administrator and now they're kind of like upset with you, or does the court keep you distance from that? Like, what is that dynamic like?
So it depends, but it is not unusual for a neutral third-party trustee or administrator to be dealing with dramatic beneficiaries. Yeah, the drama could come from the fact that they're annoyed and jealous that you were appointed and they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
But the drama can come from so many other things.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. We went on an appointment last weekend and we looked at a house. And the executor of the estate, she lives in some other state. I think it's Texas. And the house is here in Atlanta, Georgia. And the house is a borderline teardown. It's been, we call them loving hands at home, where they've done all their little upgrades over the years, but they're like, my 6-year-old can do better work than that, and then the lady was like offended when we made the offer and told her that this house needs $100,000 in work. And she's like, well, I've got a guy that can do it for 40. And I'm like, well, I'm sure you do, but I'm not going to use your guy. Like I've flipped 200 something houses over the years. I know what I'm doing. I know how much these cost. And obviously we didn't say that to her because I'm not going to break through her brain, but she was like, she's not realistic about it. And I'm like, well, it's borderline tear down. Plus the house has been smoked in for 40 years. The walls are yellow and you can see where the pictures were. It's like, we can't clean this we have to tear all this drywall out at this point. It's not even cleanable or fixable at this point. She's like, no, it's not. And I was like, you know what? Just call us back.
Right.
Talk to a few other people and then call us back later when you kind of come to reality.
Right. Well, and if she doesn't want to appreciate the value that you provide by having done this as often as you've done it and knowing your vendors and knowing what things cost, well, she's going to be one of those that's going to struggle through and probably still be doing it 2 years from now.
She will, and we'll continue to follow up with her. And one day when she comes around, we'll maybe we'll buy it, maybe we won't, but that's okay. That's why we follow up on things. So, yeah, and on that vein, when you're dealing with those people that are kind of upset, do you have any maybe conflict resolution tips for the audience, whether the audience observing this is someone going through an estate or maybe it's a real estate professional that's dealing with this dynamic? Do you have like maybe some conflict resolution tips that work best that you found?
I do. So the most important thing I've found is to allow each individual to be heard.
Okay.
And not interrupted. So, whether it's one-on-one with me or with the group, sort of a family meeting or whatever it might be, but to allow them to be heard and understand what's driving their angst.
Sure.
So what's the issue? And very often it's emotional.
Absolutely.
Very often it goes back to when the kids were, 8, 10, and 12 around their parents' kitchen table, and dad likes you better and mom likes you better and nobody liked me. So, if you can get them talking, then you can sometimes find out what's really going on. And it's usually has nothing to do with the matter at hand. It has to do with the baggage, as you mentioned before, that they're bringing to the table.
Right. And you've got to figure out you got to get that out of them. So that's a skill set that you learn. You probably ask, they call them generative questions, right? That generate more conversation. And you've got to almost like be a professional at like digging deep into their head to get out. You're almost like you're like a therapist and a fiduciary all in one, right?
Yeah, kind of. But I will say I'm not a licensed therapist, so
Yes,
let me
correct.
just
And you're
say
not a
that.
licensed attorney or not
Um,
legally
and I
inclined.
also don't see these people, for long term. It's problem focused.
Sure, sure.
Um,
Right.
it's really about allowing them to be heard and trying to really understand what it is they're saying,
Hmm.
and get a little bit underneath the words sometime
Yes.
to get to the feeling behind the words. Um, Very often, also, the issue is that people feel as though they don't know what's going on or lack
Mhm.
of communication. And
Yes.
this is very typical when I brought into a contested trust matter,
Hmm.
where let's say there was one brother who was the trustee and the other siblings are the beneficiaries, and they end up suing the brother who's the trustee for breach of fiduciary duty and want to terminate him as the trustee.
Hmm.
And in those cases, I often am brought in as the neutral, the sort of, I'm Switzerland, right?
There you go.
And in those cases, what's really important, and that I hear often from the non-trustee siblings, is our brother wouldn't tell us anything. We asked for an accounting, he wouldn't give us one. We asked for a time schedule, like a timeline, he wouldn't give us one. And very often, that's really all it is the
Mhm.
trustee, the person who was the trustee thought they were all that and had all the power and could do whatever they wanted. And frankly, to some extent, that's true
Hmm.
legally.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that's the best way to navigate as a trustee, dealing with the other beneficiaries. Because as a trustee, you have the duty to be neutral to all the beneficiaries. You can't do things to your benefit,
Right.
at their detriment. And so very often it's the kids who don't know what's going on and they're frustrated that nobody's telling them what's going on.
And do you feel like in those circumstances, it's more a case of negligence on behalf of the trustee, or it's a misunderstanding of expectations? Like which one do you
Yes.
think? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is a bad actor, a trustee who, I mean,
Okay.
I have a big case right now that had about 15 rental properties involved, and the trustee never told the other beneficiary that there was a trust. So they didn't give proper notice of the trust. They
Yeah.
didn't give them a copy of the trust. They didn't tell them the appraised value of the assets in the trust. They didn't explain what they were going to do with those assets.
Right.
And when this 4 years went by, and when the other beneficiary found out, quite by accident,
Hmm.
that there was a trust, he hired an attorney,
Sure.
a probate litigator, who went
Mhm.
after the trustee. And, um, in that case, the trustee had breached their fiduciary duty. It was clear that they should be removed,
Sure.
because they didn't do the most basic things a trustee should do. So
Right.
that's a case that's very clear and egregious.
Right.
There's many other cases where the trustee thinks they've given notice. They, once every couple months, they tell people what's going on, but they're not super responsive to questions. They find them annoying.
Right.
So, what I really teach family trustees when I'm working with them is you need to over communicate. It's going to drive you crazy.
Yep.
You're going to feel like you shouldn't have to do this,
Sure.
but you should do it anyway, because that's really where we see the big problems, is when the other parties feel like they're not being told what's going on. And the problem is when somebody feels like they're not being told something, that very quickly goes to, what are they doing that they don't want to tell me?
Sure. Yeah, your brain starts going down that path of, are they being negligent? Is this malicious? And da 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 da. And maybe it's someone they had some bad experience with in the past, and they they're still holding that against that person, in the future. You never know.
Correct. Why did dad pick him and not me? And, it could be
Sure.
that simple.
And you're like, well, based on your track record, you're not the responsible sibling. He or she is, and that's why dad. But we're not going to get into that. So when you're dealing with these family dynamics and them fighting, do you have like a piece of advice for them to like just, hey, think about this before is there something that a recurring theme that you tell them on a regular basis to think about? Is there
Yes,
something?
I tell the people in charge to overcommunicate,
Okay.
and I tell the people who are not in charge. I try to explain to them the role of the person who is in charge and what is reasonable communication and what is really not reasonable communication. And I try to explain to them that they're not a decision maker, that the person who is the decision maker may ask them for their opinion, but isn't obliged to do what they prefer to do if there's a difference of opinion. So,
Right.
I'm asking you and taking it under advisement, but that doesn't mean I'm going to do what you prefer I do. And that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Sure. Yeah. Well, because there's probably three other, siblings or heir or, beneficiaries that have their own opinions about things. We're all people. We all have our own opinions. And, that you don't have to do what they say. You're right. So one of the biggest, I would say, after doing these kinds of probate and inheritance deals for as many years as I have, one recurring theme that we run into a lot is a difference of opinion and value of the assets or the property. You've always got that one sibling or whatever who thinks that this property is worth $1 million. And for example, the lady I just told you about with the situation, right? We made her an offer and her son was there at the property. And my guy that was there said her son commented to her, was like, Mom, that's actually a really good offer. That's double what I thought it was worth, just to tell her that. And do you have like, how do you, in those situations, what are you like, do you have like, okay, we need to do this and this,
Yes.
just to shed some light to that?
Yes. So, assuming it's not a taxable estate and so a formal appraisal isn't required,
Mm-hmm.
usually don't spend the money on having a formal appraisal.
Right.
Instead, I will get 2 or 3 brokers' opinion of value
Right.
from brokers that I know well, that I know that product,
Mm-hmm.
that area, that type of real estate, whatever it might be. And usually there's a pretty good triangulation when
Mm-hmm.
you do that. There may be a range, but you're kind of between here and there.
Right.
I will typically share those with the beneficiaries and
Mm-hmm.
say, here's what we heard. Here's the one I've chosen and why.
Mm-hmm.
So, I chose to work with Brad, and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the price. In our case, it's a listing agreement.
Right.
Um, and then what we do is we put it, in our case, on the market,
Mm-hmm.
and we always hold it open a minimum of 2 weekends and the week in between before we
Right.
accept offers. That
Yep.
way it has been marketed on the amount. So it's clearly fair market value,
Sure.
whatever happens. Usually we get multiple offers
Right.
because we price it a little below
Yes.
what we think it should sell for. That generates multiple offers. And when it generates multiple offers, then it's a little bit of an auction. And
Mm-hmm.
when that happens, the number's the number. The market
Sure.
has done its work. The market has told us. And it's pretty hard for the beneficiaries to argue with that. They may not like it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's hard to argue with because we've gone through a process and they've been kept in the loop on the process.
That's great. That's a great tip because we actually do that, and as buying properties and then reselling them, and I've learned to understand market cycles. And 2 years ago, you could throw a property on the market for whatever price, and it would sell for more than that. Whether you did any value, it was crazy. The market was just bananas 2 years ago. When interest rates went up and things started to tighten a little bit, we do that strategy on all of our properties. I price it a little bit below what I think it will sell for, and we'll generally get multiple offers. And we advise people in estates to say, hey, look, if you're going to list it, this is a good strategy to do. You don't have to do this strategy, but if you're going to do it, like, this is why you do it. It's just a psychology thing. People start competing against each other and they get caught up in that, and you'll get multiple offers. And then we also kind of teach them how to vet the offers and say, this is like, watch out for these gotchas, especially when you're in the investor world. I'm an investor, right? There's a lot of snake investors in our business. Always have been, always will be, right? And we educate them on, okay, look out for this. Look out for earnest money deposit. Look for how long is their due diligence. If an investor is giving you a due diligence longer than a week, they don't know what they're doing. They should be able to determine value like that. Within a day, they should be able to. When we look at a property, a lot of times we'll give them an offer with no due diligence. I've been here. I've seen it. I know, like, this is my number and I'm going to close in 2 weeks at this number. And we tell them to kind of like watch out for those things.
Right. Well, and what I always tell the agents who I hire to represent me as a trustee is, I'm not necessarily going to take the highest offer.
Correct.
I'm going to take the best deal for me, which includes the terms.
Yep.
And then I explain to them, as a fiduciary, I have personal liability. So if the house burns down in the interim, yeah, we have insurance, but I may be on the hook. Like, I don't like vacant houses. I don't like. So because of that, what I'm typically telling the agents who work for me is, I want a quick, clean deal that's not going to get renegotiated in escrow, because in California we do escrow. I don't know how you do it in Atlanta or all the places that your listeners are. But I don't want deals to fall out of bed. So I'd rather take a slightly smaller number with squeaky clean, terms and proof of funds.
Yes.
That makes me very happy.
Yeah, I've done a bunch of videos about that. The highest offer is not always the best offer, especially in a bidding scenario where you'll get these people that are bidding against each other, and maybe the winning bidder just wants to win. I've had it where they've given me the winning. For example, I sold my in-laws' house earlier this year, the house that they lived in for 30-something years. They've downsized, moved near us and the kids. And I did the same thing. I put it on the market for a weekend. I listed it low. It was in a hot neighborhood that everybody wanted to be in. There was nothing on the market. Boom, 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 multiple offers. We get the highest offer. I look at it. It was high, and the terms were really, really good. They offered like 2 days of due diligence. And I was like, okay, that's great. All the other offers are 7 days. It sounds awesome. And we went with that. And then they backed out of the contract 4 hours after we went under contract. Like, they won it, and then I'm like, luckily, because we had multiple offers, I didn't have to put it back on the market again and have that like tarnished record. I just called the next one in line and said, hey,
right, the next one, right.
They backed out. You never believe this. They backed out. Do you want it? Okay, well, just FYI, you need to raise your bid because we got all these other offers. If I put it back on the market, it's going to go back up. Make your best shot right now. You got 2 hours to get me your best offer, and it's yours if you can give me a good offer, So,
so I'm all about terms. Give me your best and final. Give me your deposit. I don't want cashier's check or wire. Right into escrow. Like, don't play games.
Because there's so many other factors besides price that can dictate whether. Because at the end of the day, if the deal doesn't close, like we presented this. 97% of something is better than 100% of nothing, right? If it doesn't close, you get no money.
There's also a liability. Again, a lot of these probate properties are vacant properties.
Correct.
You risk squatters and the whole process to get them out, which can take months. You're paying property tax in the interim. You're paying insurance in the interim. Why do you want to do all that for a couple $1,000s? Like, it doesn't make sense.
Right. There's so much risk. I've had properties flood before. I've had 3 houses flood in my term of all the deals I've done, and it stinks. I had one just a few months ago, flooded right before closing, where we had totally renovated it, and then we had a pipe leak, and it made a mess. And it's like these things happen when properties sit. Things you never know. So you got to
Absolutely.
be.
I'll bet you've never had what I've had once, though, and that is when the buyer sneaks into the property before closing and demos the kitchen to save a little time
Oh my gosh.
before closing.
Wow.
So can you imagine the next morning what they got? They got a demand to close and,
Yeah.
and a threat that if they didn't close that day,
Right.
we threatened their agent, we were going to take them to the realtor board and, what I mean, that was outrageous.
You can't do it. Yeah, that's wild. I did have one of my flood properties. The buyers went to do their final walkthrough the day before closing. And this particular property was a probate deal, kind of very contested, took months. And there was a tenant in the property. And I cannot prove that it was her, but she's the only person that would have any reason to do this. They show up to their final walkthrough. The agent calls me, the buyer's agent calls me freaking out. She said, "We just walked in the house and there is a water hose in the bathroom window running, and there's an inch and a half of water on the floor in the bathroom." And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Like, send me a video right now." I was like, "Oh my gosh." She did that. I'm almost positive it was her. No one else would do that,
Who
right?
else would have done that?
Right. And so yeah, she stuck a water hose in the window and she turned it on and flooded the bathroom. And then the sad part was the buyers of the house had already sold their house a week before, and they were moving to this house that was like 100 and something miles away. And they had 2 goats and some chickens and dogs and cats, and their temporary occupancy on their house was up the next day. They had
That's
to
awful.
move. They couldn't go to a hotel. Where are they going to put their goats and their chickens? Like, you can't take those to Holiday Inn, won't take goats or chickens. So I had to let them move into the house. And we went ahead and closed, and they moved in, and we had to sign a bunch of stuff. And basically, they had to live in the other bedrooms. Fortunately, the flood was on one side of the house. It was in the master suite, which was on one end and whatever. So they had to live into the other bedrooms and use the other bathroom. But then they had to deal with the noise of dehumidifiers and fans running for 4 days straight. And then a month of reconstruction of this bathroom. And it was a mess. It was like,
I'm sure.
so.
Sounds horrible. Sounds like a nightmare.
Yes. So, Sheri, I really appreciate you coming on today. And if someone wants to reach out to you, whether they're in California and they, need a fiduciary, or they need some help with coaching in terms of, their estate or their elderly situation, trustee, well, how's the best way to get a hold of you? How do you have a website? How do they get in contact with you?
So our website is www.lifebridgesolutions.com. That's
Okay.
life, the opposite of death, bridge, like over the water, solutions with an S on the end.com.
Okay.
And through there, you can send an email, which will come directly to me, and our phone numbers are there as well.
Awesome. And you do the coaching pretty much anywhere, but in terms of fiduciary, that's California only, correct?
Correct.
Got it. Awesome. Well, hey, Sheri, thanks so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate all the knowledge that you provided to our audience. This was like you were referred to me by another probate attorney. She says, "You have to talk to Sheri. She's so great." So thank you so much for providing value to our audience. And you've given in the contact information. So if anyone gets a hold of you, they know how to reach out to you. Appreciate you coming on the show today. Hope you have a great day.
Thanks. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Stay tuned for the next episode. We'll talk to you later.